All right, welcome everybody for this week's Rising Tide Foundation Sunday Lecture, where I'm very, very happy that we have once again Magdalena to continue the setting the stage of the drama of the Boer War. What the heck was that all about? How did the British Empire reorganize itself, rebrand itself in this manner that I think too few people have come to really appreciate the importance of this moment in history, this dense period of potential that largely saw some really bad things born in the fires of an unjust war. So anyway, Magdalena's class, her part one was fantastic. It is going to be in the description box under this video for those who haven't watched it yet. We'll also put it in the chat box. We're going to just sit back and enjoy the ride afterwards. It's going to be a little bit of a longer class, but like usual, be patient. Put your name in the chat box. We'll call upon you on cue. And Magdalena, thank you so much for doing this, and the stage is yours.
Oh, you're very welcome. It is going to be a longer class than it was on Wednesday. We tried so hard, Gerald and I tried so hard to make it shorter, but there's just things that you cannot cut. So, okay, let me put up my PowerPoint here. Okay, so on Wednesday evening, I'm going to make a quick summary, just very, very quick, okay? We started with all the way in the beginning in 1488 when the Portuguese came to South Africa, or the Cape, I should say. And the first people, the first white people stayed there. You had a conflict between the Dutch farmers, which were called the Boers, and the British, who both wanted to take over the entire area of South Africa. The Boers basically tried to escape the British administration, and they conducted a great trek where they went towards the inside of South Africa and took over the land of the indigenous people. And had a number of very, very volatile wars. We discussed the establishment of Transvaal, which is also known as the South African Republic, and the Orange Free State, which are both Boer republics. We discussed the gold and diamond discoveries, the diamonds first, and then the gold, both in the Orange Free State and the Transvaal. We discussed the annexation of the Boer republics by the Brits and the very short war of 4 months in 1880 between the Anglos, the Brits, and the Boers. And this led up now to 1884, okay, the Berlin Conference. So the Berlin Conference took place from November 15th, 1884 to February 26, 1885. And there's a number of cartoons here showing what happened is basically you had a number of nations getting together and dividing up, carving up Africa in their different territories. So the conference was organized by Otto von Bismarck, the first Chancellor of Germany, at the request of King Leopold II of Belgium, interestingly enough, okay? You can see here the different nations that participated in it. It was a formalization of the scramble for Africa, which was already completely in full swing. And there were 14 countries there, 7 of them, Austria-Hungary, Russia, Denmark, the Netherlands, Sweden, Norway, the Ottoman Empire, and the United States came home without any formal possessions in Africa. And Germany, the International Congo Society, Spain, France, Italy, Portugal, United Kingdom, they all claimed holdings in Africa. So before the Berlin Conference, it looked, as you can see here on the map on the left, very, very colorful and very, you can see there's many different nations involved. And then on the right-hand side, you have 1913, a map of Africa at that point. We'll discuss that map later on again because there's some very peculiar items there that show you why, possibly why World War I happened. So the scramble of Africa was sped up after the conference because that conference was basically a formality. Okay, you had to as European powers, you had to actually take effective possession of the land. Okay, you couldn't just say, "Oh, it's mine," but you actually had to be there. So in Central Africa, specifically, there were expeditions were dispatched to coerce the traditional rulers into signing treaties. Force was used if necessary. For example, that's what happened to King of the Katanga from the Democratic Republic of the Congo in 1891. The Bedouin and Berber states in the Sahara and the Sahel were overrun by the French in several wars by the beginning of World War I. The British moved up from South Africa and down from Egypt and conquered states such as the Mahdist state, which is Sudan, and the Sultanate of Zanzibar, which is Tanzania. And since they had already defeated the Zulu kingdom in South Africa in 1879, they moved on to subdue and dismantle the independent Boer republics of Transvaal and the Orange Free State. So by 1902, which is after the Second Anglo-Boer War, by 1902, 90% of all the land that makes up Africa was under European control. So in the immediate aftermath of the 84-85 Berlin Conference, a small army of explorers, adventurers, traders, missionaries, empire seekers from Europe descended on the continent. The British, the way they functioned is they usually set up trading companies, often under a royal charter, to take over different parts of Africa. And then once these trading companies were established, the land in question was then annexed to the empire. So for example, you had the Royal Niger Company, which was founded in 1886. Then once that was established, Nigeria, okay, was annexed, okay, became formal rule in 1897, 1 year later. British East Africa Company was founded in 1887. Once the company was established, okay, then they moved to annex the area in 1895. So 8 years later, and Kenya and Uganda became part of the British Empire. So this shows British possession as of July 1885, okay? And you can see you have the Orange Free State in orange and the South African Republic, the Transvaal, together with Stellaland, okay? And Natal and Bechuanaland became British protectorates. Griqualand West, Griqualand East, the Cape Colony was run by the British. And you had some other countries like Swaziland, okay, Matabeleland, okay, Mozambique was run by the Portuguese, German Southwest Africa run by the Germans. So if you remember the map of Cecil Rhodes, where he's talking about taking over all of Africa and establishing a railroad from Egypt all the way down to South Africa. As you can see, Orange Free State and South African Republic would definitely be in the way of that. And of course, also, that's where the diamonds and the gold is situated. So you had in 1885, the first or the second railroad was established, completed that led from the Cape to Kimberley. Kimberley, of course, was the diamond capital. And then in 1886, gold was discovered at Witwatersrand, okay, and Johannesburg was established. And I wanted to see where it's located in the context of South Africa. So it's inward, okay? As you can see, where the little red triangle is. And it's this big area on the left. That was like an inland lake many millions of years ago. So, okay. Scientific study shows that the Golden Arc, which stretches from Johannesburg up here, okay, to Welcome down here, okay, this Golden Arc used to be a massive inland lake, and silt and gold deposits from alluvial gold settled in the area that formed the found gold. Okay, so alluvial gold is basically gold flakes, okay, that have been washed with water you can find them in sand deposits, in silt deposits, and so forth. So it's very usually very on top of the surface, and that was what was first found in the Johannesburg area. So July 1886, George Harrison finds gold on the farm, okay? There were large ditches in the beginning were being opened all along the full length of the main reef. So it was more surface digging than in-depth digging, okay? And then by 1 month later, they already had over 3,000 inhabitants there, most of them Europeans, right? So a massive influx of people. By September 8th, 9 farms located in what is now called the Central Rand were proclaimed to be public diggings. And then in October, basically 3 months later, the village of Johannesburg is officially named. And on October 4th, 1 day later, Ranjeslagte, the site of the present-day central Johannesburg, is declared. So this massive increase of Uitlanders, as they called them, which is another word for foreigners, okay, meaning not Boers, okay, came into Johannesburg, and this is comparable to the gold rush in California. This created huge problems for Paul Kruger, the president of Transvaal. The expectation at first was that this was going to be this gold deposit, since they were alluvial gold, had a short working life. But then slowly the realization began to sink in that the gold reef ran both deep and wide. And the expansion of the gold mining began to slow down in the 1880s because new deposits that were found tended to contain pyritic ore, so fool's gold. And that gold, the gold within that ore could not be extracted from this compound with the then available chemical processes or technologies. So the general consensus of the time was that Johannesburg's lifespan would be about 25 years. But then in May of 1890, the MacArthur Forest cyanide process was made the recovery of gold that came from the deep level that made it economically feasible, because that was a whole process using cyanide. The mining engineer Picard Jeppy, okay, listed a number of advantages, which is in his opinion had facilitated the gold mining in the area. And primary among these were, number one, there was an excellent climate. It was not unduly severe. There was a lack of noxious fauna and flora. You didn't have bad insects and bacteria that was dangerous to people. So the climate, excellent, okay? Number two, the ore was rich and located close to the surface. And this made the initial operations highly profitable, and also enabled the further in-depth exploration of the reef to be self-financing. So in the beginning, you didn't have to expend a lot of money in order to find the gold. which so that means that you could actually save up money for the deeper excavations later on. The capital, the mine personnel, and the technical expertise were available from the Kimberley diamond mines. And you had an influx of mining experts coming from the gold fields of Australia and North America. Some of them became real good friends of Cecil Rhodes, and we'll hear about them later. And then you had number 4, an availability of unskilled labor, okay, which he described as being virile and excellent workers under white supervision. So he's talking about unskilled labor available, referring to basically indigenous people. I pulled this graph together. It's not very detailed, but I used the figures that I could find, okay? And you can see here in Johannesburg, because I have figures for the white population, but the indigenous, I mean, they didn't, to be brutally honest, they didn't found them important, so they never counted them, okay? So in 1887, you had 3,000 people, white people in Johannesburg, the city of Johannesburg by itself. The area of the Witwatersrand, the gold area, had 7,000 at that point, okay? And then 3 years later, you had a tenfold increase. 30,000 whites in Johannesburg alone, 70,000 in the area of Witwatersrand. And then by 95, the influx was up to 51,000 white people in Johannesburg alone, and an equal amount of indigenous people. And then, as you can see, in October 1899, there was closure of all mining activity due to the war. In 1887, Cecil Rhodes established Goldfields of South Africa Company with his brother Frank. And then later on, Goldfields of South Africa Limited is formed in London during Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee, and an office established at Doorfontein in Johannesburg. In 1892, 5 years later, the company is renamed Consolidated Goldfields of South Africa with the purpose of mining the deep-level gold deposit of the Witwatersrand. And it is as it says, you had a number of gold fields that were consolidated into one company. So, and then in 94 to 96, you had the Robinson Deep, the Sub-Nigel, and Zimmer and Jack gold mines are opened, and they formed the Trinity of gold mines, and they actually called them Faith, Hope, and Charity. I think an appearance of Christianity had to be maintained somehow, okay? 1898, after initial investment of 250,000 pounds by Rhodes and Rudd, Consolidated Goldfields is rated as the most valuable company in the world. And then you had this is a bit ahead of time, ahead of our timeline, but this is a real interesting paradox. From between 1899 and 1902, that's the time of the Second Anglo-Boer War, a number of the Goldfield commandos support the Boers during the Second Anglo-Boer War, okay, while the chairman, okay, of Goldfields, okay, Lord Harris, is appointment assistant adjutant general of the Imperial Yeomanry on the British side. So the working staff, they support the Boers, and the administration is on the British side. In 1887, Zululand is annexed by the British Natal colony. So the Zulu kingdom is now, okay, defunct. In the same year, the NZASM Railway Company in the South African Republic is established, which is very important because that gives them access, okay, to the sea, okay. And in 1887, also the Johannesburg Stock Exchange is established with 68 companies. Francis William Rhodes is elected state president of the Orange Free State. So you have Mr. Rhodes, president of the Orange Free State, and Paul Kruger, president of the Transvaal or the South African Republic. And then in 1888, Nedbank is founded as the Nederlandse Bank- en Kredietvereniging for Zuid-Afrika, the Dutch Bank and Credit Union for South Africa. So they finally have a bank. So also that year, Paul Kruger is re-elected as president. I think this is now the third time, okay? Making it possible for him to extend his limitations on the political representation of the Uitlanders, foreigners, okay? So this is a problem, okay? Because what the philosophy or the idea at the time is that the Boers were running the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, and any other people who are not of Boer descent would have no say in this, okay? Which contributed a lot to the overall problem, okay? So there was a parliament, and that was called the Volksraad, and it had 24 members, okay? And the qualifications to be a member of that is you had to be born in the Republic, or you had to be a burgher of the state for 14 years. You had to be at least 30 years old. You had to be a member of the Protestant Church, and you had to have possession of property in the state, which is also land property, okay, in the state, which is also a major qualification, okay? So, but the Uitlanders are very, very adamant that they want to have representation in the Transvaal as well. And they create a lot of problems for Kruger. They want the vote. So what Kruger does in 1889, he persuades the Volksraad to pass legislation to create a second Volksraad with limited authority. And this is where the Uitlanders would have representation. And I think, quite frankly, okay, this is my thinking, that this was the punctum saliens where if Kruger would not have acted that way, the entire history of Africa would have been different. So initially, it was a unicameral body. The Volksraad was divided into two chambers in 1890, so that the Boers could still keep control over state matters, and they could give the Uitlanders, the foreigners, many of whom were temporarily employed in the mining industry, they would have a say in local affairs, and they would be able to fend off the Boers would be able to fend off the British complaints. So from 1890, there was two houses of 24 members each. The second Volksraad for the Uitlanders had suffrage for all white males above 16 years and had limited legislative powers in the fields of mining, road construction, copyright, and certain commercial affairs. But everything that they decided had to be ratified by the first Volksraad. So this was the highest authority in charge of the state policy. And preference was given to the fully franchised burghers, okay, for appointment to government posts. The members of the first Volksraad were elected for 4 years, and the first Volksraad members had to be born in the state. And the second Volksraad of the Uitlander was pretty much without power because everything that they decided on had to be ratified by the first Volksraad. So if the first Volksraad, the Boers didn't like it, then it wasn't going to happen. Also in 1888, Okay, the Rhodes concession in Matabeleland in Zimbabwe was pulled off. Okay, the Rhodes concession was a written concession for exclusive mining rights in Matabeleland, Mashonaland, and other adjoining territories in what you call today Zimbabwe. And it was granted by King Lobengula of Matabeleland to Charles Rhodes concession, James Rochford Maguire, and Francis Thompson. And these three agents, okay, acted on behalf of Cecil Rhodes, okay, on October 30th, 1880. Big friends of his. And this concession proved the foundation for the royal charter that was granted by the United Kingdom to Rhodes British South Africa Company in October 1889. So, okay. I had a few slides where actually the text of the concession, with the text of the concession, but we decided to just leave it. It takes a lot of time to read it. This is the handwritten copy on the right-hand side, you can see. So the concession conferred on the grantees, okay, the sole right to mine throughout King Lobengula's country. They had the power to defend this right by force, and they in return had to give weapons and regular monetary stipends to the king. So, okay, starting in early 1889, the king repeatedly tried to disavow the document on the grounds of deceit by Rhodes and Thompson, etc., regarding the settled terms. Only Rhodes really understood most of the terms, okay? And the king insisted that they were orally agreed to restrictions on the grantees' activities, and that these orally agreed to restrictions were supposed to be part of the contract. He even went so far that he sent people to persuade the British government, to persuade them that the concession was invalid. They went to meet Queen Victoria at Windsor Castle, but these efforts proved completely unsuccessful. Yeah, why would the British give back those rights? So the British South Africa Company was a brainchild of Rhodes, and it was incorporated in October 1888. It became it got a royal charter in December of 1889. The royal charter was handed out because of having gotten the Rhodes concession. And so this was how you say it, okay, an important part, okay, for getting the royal charter. Initially, the royal charter was signed for a period of 25 years, and then it was extended a further 10 years, and then it expired in 1924. So the British South Africa Company was an amalgamation of two different groups. There was a London-based group headed by Lord Gifford and George Coston, and backed financially by Baron Nathan de Rothschild. And then you had a South African group with Rhodes and his associates, including Alfred Bate, okay, with the resources of the De Beers Syndicate and Goldfields of South Africa. And these two groups had originally been in competition, but then they united because of common economic interests. The British South Africa Company had their own army. So in July 1890, Cecil Rhodes became Prime Minister of the Cape Colony after getting support from the English-speaking white and non-white voters and a number of Afrikaner bonds. Okay, whom he had offered shares in the British South Africa Company. So the Afrikaner Bond is a group actually almost like the first political party in South Africa, which stemmed from the Boers, and they were mainly Boers, okay? And but they lived in the Cape Colony. They didn't live in Transvaal or in Orange Free State. So he offered them shares in the British South Africa Company, and therefore they voted for him. And so he becomes prime minister, okay? So in 1892, he pushes through the Franchise and Ballot Act of 1892. And the idea was to control the small amount of colored voters in the Cape, okay? Since 1872, you were able to vote if you had property, land, okay, valued at 25 pounds. With the Franchise and Ballot Act of 1892, the franchise qualifications rose from 25 pounds to 75 pounds. That was a significant increase, and it effectively disenfranchised non-whites in significant enough numbers to make their voting powers negligible, okay? And some poor whites were also disenfranchised because they didn't have land valued at 75 pounds. Okay, so we'll have a series of people who are now coming, appearing here in our history of South Africa. Mohandas Gandhi, okay, came to South Africa in 1893, the same year. Okay, same year Kruger is elected for the third time as state president of the South African Republic. So I was wrong the previous time. 1888 was the second time, 1893 the third time, okay? 23-year-old Gandhi arrives in Durban, okay? And Gandhi had struggled in India after he returned from his studies for the bar in London. And so in 1894, he accepted, okay, a modest offer of 105 pounds sterling and a first-class round-trip fare and expenses to work as a counsel in a law firm in Natal, South Africa. And Gandhi knew nothing about the colony's indentured laborers imported from India 3 decades earlier to work in coffee, sugar, and tea plantations in South Africa, sorry, okay. But by 1890, some 40,000 mostly male Indians had been lured into semi-slavery through contracts that were binding them into service for a specified term. Because there was not very many opportunities at home in India, plus there was a shortfall of cheap labor in Natal, that meant that more than half of the migrant Indians remained in South Africa after their 5-year contracts were concluded. And by 1891, some almost 50,000 Indians were resident in the coastal colony of Natal, which was dominated by the British, okay? And you also had in Natal, in that area, about almost 500,000 native people. Only 10,729 men could then vote in Natal, okay? All of them European, apart from a handful. There was another tier of Indian merchants and professionals and traders and white-collar workers in the smaller inland colony of Transvaal that was ruled by the Afrikaners, Boers, okay? And all of the Indian settlers were contemptuously and without distinction dubbed coolies and forbidden to walk on footpaths or be out at night without permits. So you were very limited in what you could do. The typical working week of most Indian laborers who worked on the sugar plantations was were 6 days and 9 hours each day. But during the crushing and planting seasons, they were working 17 to 18-hour days, okay? And they had abnormally high disease and death rates. And indentured Indians also suffered privations and immigration restrictions. They could not go further than 2 miles beyond their place of work without written permission. And Indians were forbidden to own land in Natal, okay, while the ownership was more permissible for native-born people. So without land ownership, one was not able to vote, okay, since they didn't have any land, okay, they couldn't vote. We will hear more about Gandhi later. In 1894, okay, the Glenn Gray Act is introduced in the Parliament of the Cape Colony. It's instigated by the government of Prime Minister Cecil Rhodes. What happened is that the Afrikaner bondsmen, which is the first political party of the Boers, who were still living in the Cape Colony, these are the people left behind who did not go on the Great Trek, okay? They came to Rhodes to complain. They complained about the number and rise of Africans, indigenous, with property, which means they could vote. These people were competing with the Boers, with the Afrikaners, okay? And these people would rather vote for the English, okay, than the Boers. So they came to complain to Cecil Rhodes that he had to do something about that. And in response to these complaints, Rhodes then decided to give them the Glenn Gray Act. And this Glenn Gray Act would disenfranchise the native Africans competing with the Afrikaners. It would ensure that the Africans could not own farms, okay, which would compete with the Afrikaners. Afrikaners were mainly farmers. So the Glenn Gray Act also pressured indigenous Africans to enter the labor market, okay? So first, you severely restrict the Africans' access to land and land ownership. Never mind that it was all theirs in the beginning anyway, okay? So they could not become owners of the means of production. And what they did is the Glenn Gray Act imposed a 10-shilling labor tax on all indigenous Africans who could not prove that they had been in bona fide wage employment for at least 3 months in a year. So if you were not employed for 9 months, okay, you had to pay a 10-shilling labor tax. Well, if you weren't working, then where did you get the money from? So this land shortage, coupled with the tax for not working, okay, would push thousands of Africans into the migrant labor market. They were forced to work so they could pay, or they didn't have to pay the tax. Okay, so this system of labor migration would then feed into the mines in both Kimberley and the Rand with cheap migrant labor. Initially, this was only applied to the Glen Gray district, okay? But then later on, it was extended to a larger area. And this radically reduced the voting franchise for Africans, for indigenous. It affected their land rights claims and where they could live, okay? They were no longer allowed to sell land without the permission of the governor, and they were not allowed to divide or sublet the land or give it as inheritance to more than one heir, all in favor of controlling votes, okay? And the Glen Gray area and the Transkei should remain purely native territories. So this became eventually, later on, that became the foundation of the 1913 Natives Land Act, which was a precursor to the apartheid policy of the development and creation of the Bantustans. So the Glen, okay, Cecil Rhodes gave a speech, okay, on the second rereading of the Glen Grey Act to the Cape House Parliament on July 30th, 1894. Jerry, would you be so kind and read that?
Yes. The proposition that I would wish to put to the House is this, that I do not feel that the fact of our having to live with the natives in this country is a reason for serious anxiety. In fact, I think the natives should be a source of great assistance to most of us. At any rate, if the whites maintain their position as the supreme race, the day may come when we shall all be thankful that we have the natives with us in their proper position. We shall be thankful that we have escaped those difficulties which are going on amongst all the old nations of the world.
Okay. And I'm sure he's also referring to what happened in the United States of America. So the Glen Grey Act radically curtailed the number of Africans who could vote, okay? And it marked the beginning of the end of for the African franchise. And this new law also allowed the annexation for Pondoland. And you can see here on the map, Pondoland, okay? It's on the Indian Ocean, okay? Important because it's on the coast. So the Glen Grey Act denied the vote to Africans from Pondoland. So no matter their education or if they had property. And okay. So they had no vote, okay? And because of this, through the adaptation of the act, Rhodes then gradually managed to persuade the parliament to abandon Britain's 19th century ideal that in principle, all persons, irrespective of color, were equal before the law. Because with this act, Glen Grey Act, this was not happening anymore. All right, we're getting to Joseph Chamberlain, okay? Colonial Secretary of Britain under the Marquis of Salisbury, Arthur Balfour. Chamberlain took formal charge of the colonial office in Great Britain on July 1st, 1895, and he would remain in that position for 8 years, so during the entire Second Boer War, okay? He served as Secretary of State for the colonies. He promoted a variety of schemes to build up the empire in Asia, Africa, and the West Indies. Very early on, he was an outspoken anti-imperialist, but then changed his mind. By 1895, he fully embraced imperial federation. He wanted a closer relation between Great Britain and the settler colonies. He wanted to expand the empire in Africa, the Americas, and Asia, and reorder imperial trade through preferential tariffs, okay? Preferential for Britain, of course. He had major responsibility for causing the Second Boer War between 1899 and 1902 in South Africa, and he was the government minister most responsible for the war effort. Chamberlain stated very confidently, "I believe that the British race is the greatest of the governing races that the world has ever seen. It is not enough to occupy great spaces of the world's surface unless you can make the best of them. It is the duty of a landlord to develop his estate." And accordingly, he advocated investment in underdeveloped possessions, especially Africa and the West Indies, which earned him the nickname Joseph Africanus among the press. And we will hear a lot more about Chamberlain later, okay? Another person that pops up in South Africa, okay, is Rudyard Kipling. Rudyard Kipling, the poet, okay, visited South Africa first in 1891. He was a very close friend of Cecil Rhodes, okay? He was such a good friend that Cecil Rhodes built him a holiday home, the Woolsack, on his estate, so that the Kipling family could spend the English winter in Cape Town every year. And here you see Rudyard Kipling sitting on the table writing. Rudyard Kipling wrote a poem called If. And actually, we heard about that last Sunday, okay, by the speaker then. And so this poem was, according to Kipling's own autobiography, was inspired by the exploits of Leander Starr Jameson, in particular the Jameson raid, which we will come to very shortly, okay? So if you read that poem and you find it's okay, it's a good poem, okay? But think about what inspired it, and that will sour your taste for it. So with his new reputation as poet of the empire, Kipling was warmly received by some of the influential politicians of the Cape Colony, including Rhodes, Sir Alfred Milner, Leander Starr Jameson. Kipling cultivated their friendships and came to admire the men and their politics. And back in England, Kipling wrote poetry in support of the British cause in the Boer War. And on his next visit to South Africa in the 1900s, he became a correspondent for the Friend newspaper in Bloemfontein, which had been commandeered by Lord Roberts for the British troops. So, and of course, in February 1899, Rudyard Kipling wrote a poem entitled The White Man's Burden. Jerry, can you read that, please?
The White Man's Burden by Rudyard Kipling. Take up the white man's burden. Send forth the best ye breed. Go, bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child.
This, of course, is just an excerpt from the poem, okay? This actually was entitled, the proper title of this poem is The White Man's Burden, the United States and the Philippine Islands. And in this poem, what Rudyard Kipling is doing is urging the United States to take up the burden of empire, as had Britain and other European nations. So he is urging the United States to become an empire as well, especially regarding the Philippines. Okay, we are coming to the drift crisis of 1895. If you don't know what the drift crisis is, here the picture shows you what a drift is, okay? It's a ford in a river. So since there was lack of bridges, people would find shallow waters in a river so they could cross over to the other side. So this is a drift or a ford. So landlocked Transvaal was forced to rely on British colonial railways and ports. And the Transvaal awarded the construction of a railway to the Netherlands South African Railway Company, NZASM, okay? So, however, by mid-1891, the NZASM was on the verge of bankruptcy. The line was running from Pretoria to Lourenço Marques, today it's called Maputo, in today's Mozambique, so Portuguese territory, to the coast there. The Cape Colony Prime Minister Cecil Rhodes offered a loan to Paul Kruger in exchange for building the Cape Line, which is the line going to the Cape Colony, okay? And once the Cape Colony, well, they were not building the line to Lourenço Marques, but they wanted to have a line going from the Transvaal, okay, all the way to the Cape Colony. Once the Cape Colony had finished building the railway line to Johannesburg, it wanted to get as much of the railway traffic of the Transvaal as possible by reducing its rates. So they reduced the rates on the railway to transport goods, okay? And they were very much aware that the Delagoa Bay line at the Transvaal was almost complete. So, okay, they reduced the rates. Okay. So what the Transvaal did, they increased the rates on the railway line on the part that ran through, okay, the Transvaal. Once it crossed the Vaal River. The Vaal River is kind of the border river between Cape Colony and Transvaal. Okay, so they increased the rates, which made it economically not feasible anymore for the Brits to transport goods on the railroad. So what the Cape Colony did, they took the goods that were on the railroad, they took them off the railroad, put them on wagons, okay, and transported it by wagons through the Transvaal to avoid paying the higher prices. So what Kruger did at that point, he blocked access to the Transvaal by closing the drifts, the forts on the Transvaal side. So you have people stationed there, not allowing people to put those wagons across the river. So there was a great deal of anger towards this protectionism and exclusion, not only in the Cape Colony, but also in the Orange Free State and among the Afrikaners, okay? And the Afrikaner Bond, the anti-imperialist party, the Boer party in Cape Colony, okay, they supported the strong stand by the Rhodes government and they urged action. They even urged war if the drifts were not reopened. And eventually the South African Republic did relent and the crisis passed. But it created a lot of bad blood. So there was a lingering clashes of interests. The Afrikaners outside the South African Republic wanted access to the markets of the Rand, of the Johannesburg area, where the gold is, and to share in the wealth being generated by the gold mining, okay? The South African Republic government wanted to preserve the market for its own farmers, build up manufacturing to help employ its landless white burghers, and make itself as free as possible from influence by the British. And of course, the British wanted access to the riches of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State and wanted to take over the two republics. So, lot of tension. So, the British government demanded that Kruger open the drifts and use the situation to involve itself directly in the Transvaal affairs. Rhodes was infuriated and he planned an uprising of the Uitlanders in Johannesburg, of the foreigners in Johannesburg, his buddies, his friends, okay? And the uprising was supposed to be timed to coincide with an invasion of the Transvaal from Bechuanaland, which is present-day Botswana, led by Dr. Leander Starr Jameson, his friend, okay? So Jameson was supposed to invade Transvaal from Botswana, okay? And at the same time, the Uitlanders in Johannesburg were supposed to create an uprising. And then Rhodes wanted to take over the government of the Transvaal and turn it into a British colony, and that would join all the other colonies in a federation. So what Rhodes did, he organized a reform committee that existed late in 1895 and early 1896, okay? This was organized by Rhodes, okay? It had the tactic support of the British Secretary of State for the Colonies, Joseph Chamberlain, okay? And the Reform Committee had a number of prominent Johannesburg citizens. He was headed up by Sir Lionel Phillips. He was a British-born South African financier, mining magnate, and politician. Charles Leonard, he was an attorney in Johannesburg. Colonel Frank Rhodes, the brother of Cecil Rhodes. John Hayes Hammond, and here we're talking about, okay, an American mining engineer, diplomat and philanthropist, in charge of Cecil Rhodes mines in South Africa, and Victor Clement, a chief mining engineer from California. So, okay, they've they were the reform committee, okay? And this reform committee went to Kruger and says, we need a stable constitution, we need a fair franchise law so we can vote, we need an independent judiciary, we need a better educational system. And Kruger made promises, as he was wont to do, okay, but failed to keep them. So, okay, and the British and Jewish businessmen protested against the Boer Transvaal government's discriminatory attitude to the Uitlanders in Johannesburg. And additionally to that, okay, the Kruger government had been putting pressure on the mining companies. He put heavy taxes on them. He established monopolies over items such as the dynamite that was needed for deep level blasting, okay? And also, okay, the railway construction led to high transport tariffs. There was a lot of pressure put on, okay, the people, okay? So no attempt was made by Kruger's government to solve these grievances by peaceful discussion and negotiations. Again, okay, so we had the two Volksrats, okay, and we had this whole situation, and Kruger, they were so adamant that Boers were running the whole affair, and I think that was their Achilles heel. So the Jameson raid was launched on December 29th, 1895, and this was a cartoon published at the time. And there's also a link to a video on YouTube that I recommend people watching. It's a guy called the history, I forget, you watch it, it's good, okay? So the raid was launched on December 29th, 1895, okay? When Jameson, an armed man, okay, from the Boer Republic, from the Botswana, crossed the border, okay? However, Jameson was a little bit too hasty. Okay. Earlier, while he was waiting on the border to come to get the word from Rhodes to start, okay, the Uitlander leaders in Johannesburg were arguing among themselves what kind of government they were going to put in place after the invasion. And many of the Uitlanders had no interest in a violent uprising, okay? And because of all the discussion and, okay, Rhodes actually had decided to call off the raid, but by that time it was too late, okay? Jameson and his party had already crossed into the Transvaal. Communication was lacking, plans were botched. The telephone lines, all the telegraph lines were supposed to be cut, but were not all being cut, okay? Consequently, the Boers received warning of the attack, and Jameson was forced to surrender on January 2nd, 1896 at Doornkop near Krugersdorp. The raid had been a failure, okay? Chamberlain had planned to help plan a Jameson raid, but he is back in Britain, okay? And then when he heard that this raid was to be launched, he panicked and changed his mind. And he said, if this succeeds, it will ruin me. I'm going up to London to crush it. He was at his home, okay? Chamberlain ordered the Governor General of the Cape Colony to condemn the Jameson raid and Rhodes for planning it. And he also instructed every British worker in Transvaal not to support it, okay? So the raid failed. As a consequence of the raid, Rhodes was forced to resign as the Prime Minister of the Cape Colony. Chamberlain denied any knowledge of the raid, okay, and somehow managed to stay in office. Jameson and the various Uitlanders were handed over to the British authorities in the Cape, and they were sent back to the UK for trial in London. And initially, they were convicted of treason and sentenced to death for their part in the plan. But then the sentences, okay, you know, stalling with time and so forth, the sentences were commuted to heavy fines and token prison stays. And then finally, after a long time, so Jameson served only 4 months of a 15-month sentence, okay? And the British South Africa company was required to pay nearly £1 million in compensation to the Transvaal government, okay? Interestingly enough, okay, Jameson, Leander Starr Jameson, okay? So here is almost getting executed, okay, almost, okay? But then later on, after the Boer War, after the Second Anglo-Boer War, he becomes Prime Minister of the Cape Colony from 1904 till 1908. Very curious. So the political problems between the Afrikaans and English-speaking colonists became worse than ever. The Orange Free State cooperated more closely with the Transvaal. The Transvaal residents felt that they were being threatened, and the Uitlanders were treated with more suspicion than ever before. And this growing resentment, accentuated itself into the Second Boer War. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany sends a telegram, January 3rd, 1896, okay, congratulating State President Paul Kruger on repelling the Jameson raid. And this caused a huge scandal in Britain, okay? The Transvaal interpreted the telegram as a sign of possible German support in the future, okay? Wilhelm's intention was to demonstrate to the British that they were diplomatically isolated and should become friendly with Germany, and that there was a big blunder. And instead, this telegram that he sent aroused the first wave of popular hostility against Germany in Britain in the pre-World War period. And there are many considering this actually being an early incident in the series of escalations that led to World War I. So we're stepping back a little bit, okay. 1885, you see there's some internal development, okay, of South Africa and the republics, okay. The Graaf electric lightning work at the site of the Molteno Dam becomes the first hydroelectric plant in South Africa, the first power plant in Cape Town, and the second electric power plant in South Africa. In 86, you had the South African School of Mines is established, which would later become the University of the Witwatersrand and the University of Pretoria. And in 1997, part of Zululand is incorporated into the British colony of Natal. King Solomon Dinizulu is exiled, okay? And then, okay, and this is becoming really, really important. 1897, same year, Sir Alfred Milner becomes British High Commissioner for South Africa and Governor of the Cape Colony. That same year, the rinderpest epidemic killed 90% of Southern and East Africa's cattle, 90%, which of course caused massive starvation. It killed as many people as the Black Death, okay? It wiped out a third of Ethiopia's population. It had a massive effect on the continent's wildlife. And in 1898, Paul Kruger is elected state president of the South African Republic for the 4th time. So this is the rinderpest of 1896. Okay, Alfred Milner, first Viscount Milner, becoming governor, okay, of the Cape Colony. And just a minute.
She'll be back in a second.
Sorry about that. Sorry about that. Okay. So Alfred Milner was a year younger than Cecil Rhodes. Both of them studied at Oxford University. Milner from 1872 to 1876. Rhodes was there from 1873 to 1874, and then again from 1876 to 1881 with spurts between England and South Africa. Okay. He became governor of the Cape Colony and High Commissioner for South Africa on May 5th, 1897, and he stayed in that position until March 6th, 1901, okay? And he was the one who pushed the Transvaal Republic to war. He oversaw the war, and he organized so-called reconstruction after the war, okay? At Oxford, he formed close friendship with the young economic historian Arnold Toynbee. He wrote a paper in support of his theories of social work, and in 1895, 12 years after Toynbee's death, at the age of 30, he wrote a tribute, Arnold Toynbee, a reminiscence. Milner was the founder of the Round Table. It was a quarterly journal, a quarterly review of the politics of the British Empire. This was in 1910, after the war, okay, after the establishment of South Africa as a country, okay, and which helped to promote the cause of imperial federation in Britain. He had concern that there was a lack of support for the expansion of the British Empire inside Britain, and the Round Table was supposed to bring greater awareness of imperial issues to the British public. Milner was a devoted servant of empire and was personally invested in extending the power of the empire. He believed, like Rhodes, that the British were superior to every other race and that humanity would become more civilized living under British rule. Jerry, would you please read the quote?
There is only one possible settlement, war. It has got to come. The difficulty is in the occasion and not the job itself. That is very easily done. And I think nothing of the bogeys and difficulties of settling South Africa afterwards. You will find a very different tone and temper when the center of unrest is dealt with.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And this one, please.
If 10 years hence, there are 3 men of British race to 2 of Dutch, the country, that is South Africa, will be safe and prosperous.
So Alfred Milner was born in 1854 in the town of Gießen in the Duchy of Hesse in Germany. He was educated at Tübingen and at King's College, then attended Balliol College at Oxford University. He studied under John Ruskin and Benjamin Jowett. He became friends with Arnold Toynbee. He graduated in 1877 with a degree in classics. He joined the Pall Mall Gazette as a journalist in 1881 and eventually became assistant editor. And he went into politics after his stint in journalism, but lost in the general election. He broke with Prime Minister Gladstone's wing of the Liberal Party over the issue of Home Rule for Ireland. He served as private secretary to George Goschen, a former Liberal who became Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1887 under Lord Salisbury and the Conservative Party. And Goschen, he used his influence to get Milner appointed as Undersecretary of Finance in Egypt, which was then a colony of Britain. And Milner served in this post for 4 years and returned to England in 1892. There he became appointed as chairman of the Board of Inland Revenue, where he remained until 1897. Milner was appointed to replace Lord Rosemead, Hercules Robinson, as High Commissioner for South Africa and Governor of the Cape Colony when Hercules Robinson resigned in 1897. He was appointed by Joseph Chamberlain, at the time the Colonial Secretary in the English Cabinet, and Milner arrived at the Cape in May 1897. So right away, he engaged with the President of the Transvaal, Paul Kruger, to address a crisis regarding the franchise status of the Uitlanders, which we discussed a little bit earlier, okay? mostly foreign Englishmen who descended on the Republic after the discovery of gold in 1886. And between August of 1897 and May 1898, he traveled through the Cape Colony, the Bechuanaland Protectorate, Rhodesia, and Basutoland, which is present-day Lesotho, which bordered the Cape Colony, Natal Colony, and Natal Colony, and Orange River Colony. So he wanted to better understand the point of view of the Cape Dutch, or he wanted to understand how they thought, okay, and the burghers of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. And Milner also during this period learned both Dutch and the South African Taal Afrikaans. So he came to the conclusion that there could be no hope of peace and progress in South Africa while there remained the permanent subjection of British to Dutch in one of the republics. The Transvaal Republic stood in the way of Britain's Cape to Cairo ambitions. And Milner realized that with the discovery of gold in the Transvaal, the balance of power in South Africa had shifted from Cape Town to Johannesburg. And he feared that if the whole of South Africa were not quickly brought under British control, the newly wealthy Transvaal, controlled by Afrikaners, could unite with the Cape Afrikaners and jeopardize the entire British position in South Africa. Milner held hostile views towards the Afrikaners and became the most prominent voice in the British government, advocating war with the Boer republics to secure British control over the region. In November of 1898, Milner went to England on a working holiday, during which he informed the British government of the state of play in South Africa. And he met with Chamberlain on November 22nd and argued that a crisis had to be engineered since Kruger had become more autocratic since his re-election. Chamberlain, however, was against entering into a war. After meeting Milner for the first time, this is a bit later, the Boer soldier and future politician Jan Smuts predicted that he would become more dangerous than Rhodes and would become a second Bartle Frere. Now, Bartle Frere, okay, was a British colonial administrator. He had a successful career in India. He became governor of Bombay, and then he became High Commissioner for South Africa from 1877 to 1880. And he implemented a set of policies which attempted to impose a British confederation on the region, and which led to the overthrow of the Cape's first elected government in 1878, and to a string of regional wars, culminating in the invasion of Zululand and the First Boer War. The British Prime Minister Gladstone recalled Frere to London to face charges of misconduct, and Whitehall officially censored Frere for acting recklessly. So here is John Smuts, okay, Boer soldier, okay, predicting that this Milner was going to become more dangerous than Rhodes and become equal to a second Bartle Frere. On May 4th, 1899, Milner wrote a dispatch to the Colonial Office, in which he insisted that the resolution for the unrest in the Transvaal was to strike at the root of the evil, the political, impotence of the injured, i.e. the Uitlanders who had no vote. He said, "It may seem a paradox," he wrote, "but it is true that the only way for protecting our subjects is to help them to cease to be our subjects. The policy of leaving things alone only led from bad to worse, and the case for intervention is overwhelming." Milner felt that only the enfranchisement of the Uitlanders in the Transvaal would give stability to the South African situation. he had not based his case against the Transvaal on the letter of the conventions, meaning the London and Pretoria conventions, okay? And he was not even referring to the word suzerainty, okay, in his letter, okay? He realized that the spectacle of thousands of British subjects in the Transvaal in the condition of helots, that's how he called it, was undermining the prestige of Great Britain throughout South Africa. Since the Brits in Transvaal had no rights, okay, that this was a black stain on the prestige of Great Britain. He called for some striking proof of the intention of the British government not to be ousted from its predominant position. This dispatch was telegraphed to London, and it was intended to be immediately publicized, but there was a decision made to keep it private for a time by the Home Government. Okay, on May 30th, 1899, Paul Kruger and the British High Commissioner for South Africa, Alfred Milner, and also the President Martinus Stein of the Orange Free State, okay, met at a conference in Bloemfontein, okay, to talk about the franchise questions. But the negotiations quickly broke down. Within 6 days, the conference ended without any resolution whatsoever. In September of 1899, Chamberlain sent an ultimatum demanding full equality for British citizens residents in Transvaal. Okay, so the vote. Okay, Kruger, he was already sure that the war was inevitable, simultaneously issued his own ultimatum before receiving Chamberlain's. Okay, and this gave the British 48 hours to withdraw all their troops from the border of Transvaal. Otherwise, the Transvaal, allied with the Orange Free State, would be at war with them. And, okay, in September, okay, also, the Parliament of the Orange Free State resolved, they had a previous secret agreement, okay, that the Parliament resolved so that they could assist the Transvaal in the event of a war with England. And the South African War, or the Anglo-Boer War, broke out on October 11th, 1899. It would last much longer than the British anticipated, okay, for a full 3 years. Okay. This is a picture or cartoon, okay, that was published in Amsterdam, okay, and it shows the Transvaal and the Orange Free State as the virgins tied to a burning stake, okay, which is lit by John Bull, which is the British version of the American Uncle Sam. And all of the European powers seem to be standing by watching, but not helping the virgins. So this is the extent of the British Empire in 1898, prior to the outbreak of the Second Boer War, okay? You can see the little two gray plots down here. That's Orange Free State and Transvaal. So, okay, the British forces, they thought that the war would be easily won, but they were wrong, okay? The two Boer republics were the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. There were 3 phases of the war. There was the Boer offensive, okay? That went from October to December of 1899. It culminated with Black Week. Black Week was a term that the British media coined because it was an absolute horrible week for the British, which we'll see in a minute, okay? The second phase was the British offensive from January to September 1900, and then the guerrilla war started, which lasted from September 1900 to May 1902. You can see here the commanders and leaders in this war, okay? On the left hand, the British section, you had Chamberlain at home in Britain, Alfred Milner, Frederick Roberts, Paul Methuen, Redvers Buller, we'll hear about him, Herbert Kitchener, of course, Rudolph Lambert, Robert Baden-Powell, okay, the famous scout founder, okay, Herbert Plummer, from Canada, Francois-Louis Lézard, and from New Zealand, Walter Tunbridge, okay. And on the Boer side, you had Paul Kruger as the head of Transvaal, Martinus Stein as the head of Orange State. You had Coos de la Rey, Louis Botha, Jacques Burger, Piet Cronje, Piet Joubert, and Christian de Wet. Christian de Wet, okay, very famous general for the Boer side, and Louis Botha, we'll hear about him later also, okay. Now on the right-hand side, you can see the number of troops, okay. So on the British side, 550,000 to 600,000 soldiers were involved in this war. On the Boer side, 60,000 to 61,000 plus. So 10 times less. And you have the casualty and losses. And on the bottom, you have the civilian casualties, but we'll talk about that later. So during all of this, okay, Milner came up with a scheme to anglicize the Transvaal area during the Anglo-Boer War, okay? He set out to influence British education in the area for the English-speaking populations in the Transvaal. So he founded a series of schools known as the Milner schools in South Africa, okay? So you can see the names, and some of them still exist today. All right, okay. Rudyard Kipling and Winston Churchill. We talked about Rudyard Kipling already, okay? Winston Churchill was there. So they both were in South Africa at the beginning of the Second Boer War. And they had common experiences, but they had complete opposite visions. Not complete, I shouldn't say complete, okay? They had different attitudes, I guess. So Churchill later presented the Boers as loyal enemies to be fought but respected. Kipling, on the other side, saw them as treacherous guerrillas who deserved due punishment, and he heavily emphasized the threat they represented to the British Empire. So here you see Kipling sitting with Cecil Rhodes and a loyal servant in behind, okay? And we have Winston Churchill there on his horse. So Winston Churchill, okay, managed to secure the lucrative assignment to report on the war for the Morning Post, okay? And so this is his last youthful military adventure. And he set off and he arrived in Cape Town late on the 30th October of 1899. He was famously captured only 2 weeks later by the Boers. He was on an armored train traveling through Boer-occupied territory. This train was ambushed and derailed, okay? And the following month, during his 25th birthday, he spent the following month imprisoned. He made a dramatic escape by climbing over a wall, riding a freight train, hiding in a coal mine, and eventually boarding a train into Portuguese East Africa. He made his way to Durban, okay? The Boers were offering a reward of £25 for the recapture of their well-known prisoners, dead or alive. And for the next 6 months, he kind of didn't know, or he completely ignored the issue of him being a reporter. And I guess he thought he was both a soldier and a reporter, a soldier for the British Empire and a reporter. So for the next 6 months, he encountered fire. He took part in the bloody and unsuccessful Battle of Spion Kop in January 1900. And as the war turned in Britain's favor, was present at the relief of Ladysmith and the occupation of Pretoria. Okay, His brother Jack was wounded and became one of the first patients to be treated by their mother. Lady Randolph was there too on the hospital ship she had organized, okay? And Churchill's luck held. He returned back to England in July 1900. The war was not over then, okay? The guerrilla phase was just starting, okay? The Brits already thought that the war was over. Churchill was hailed a hero. He had speaking engagements everywhere. Because of this hero status, he ran for election and he won election in the British Parliament, okay? He went, but then he had to raise money. So he went on speaking tours, talking about his adventure in South Africa. He even went so far as going to United States of America, where he encountered Mark Twain. And Mark Twain had been in South Africa as well, but Mark Twain had complete different views of this whole war than Churchill did. So they had a few run-ins together. So here is Churchill on the right, okay? This speaking tour made more money for Churchill, so he was pretty secure in his political position when he came back to England. Okay, another famous Brit, Sir Arthur Ignatius Conan Doyle, okay? He came to Great Britain, to South Africa too. He was born in Edinburgh, Scotland on May 22nd, 1859. He was a trained medical doctor. He had graduated from Edinburgh University in 1881. And because of his qualification, he was sent to South Africa in 1900 to serve as a medic for the British troops. In 1902, wrote a pamphlet on the war called The War in South Africa, Its Causes and Conduct, okay? He thought he had to write this pamphlet to respond to all the charges leveled against the British for their conduct during the war. So he was defending the Brits, okay? He defended the British position in the pamphlet, and his work became so popular that he was knighted in October 1902. He also wrote a book called The Great Boer War. And later on, he became famous for looking for ghosts. He was involved in the spiritualism movement. Another fellow, okay, famous fellow, okay, Gandhi. You can see him right here in the middle, right center, okay, of the middle row, okay. Gandhi was in the Boer War. Okay, since Gandhi was a British citizen, he felt he had to side with the British. He did not believe in war, but he volunteered to form an ambulance corps to help the British wounded. And Gandhi and other volunteers carried wounded soldiers off the battlefield. The ambulance corps that Gandhi led consisted of African and Indian-born Hindus, Muslims, and Christians. And he had hoped that the good work done by the volunteers would impress the British. Remember, people from India had no rights whatsoever in South Africa. They couldn't even walk on the same sidewalk. So this would impress the British, and he hoped that the British would grant more civil rights to the Indians. Gandhi and 38 members of the corps were awarded the South African War Medal for courage for what he had done there. So he said, okay, when the war was declared, this is in his own biography, okay, when the war was declared, my personal sympathies were all with the Boers. But I believed then that I had not yet no right in such cases to enforce my individual convictions. And then later on, suffice it to say that my loyalty to the British rule drove me to participation with the British in that war. I felt that if I demanded rights as a British citizen, it was also my duty as such to participate in the defense of the British Empire. He was awarded a medal, okay? Gandhi returned this medal in 1920, gave it back, okay, as part of the national campaign protesting in the support of the Khilafat movement in India. Okay, so Gandhi's people were not the only ones that came to help. Okay, there was help from around the world. The British expeditionary forces efforts were aided by colonial forces from the Cape Colony, the Natal, Rhodesia, as well as Australia, Canada, India, New Zealand. Okay, and later in the war, the Black Africans recruits contributed increasingly to the British war efforts. International public opinion was generally more sympathetic to the Boers and hostile to the British. Even within the United Kingdom, there existed significant opposition to the war. As a result, the Boer cause attracted thousands of volunteers from neutral countries all over the world, including the German Empire, United States, Russia, and even some parts of the British Empire, such as Australia and Ireland. And many consider the Boer War as marking the beginning of the questioning of the British Empire's veneer of impenetrable global dominance. This is due to the war's surprisingly long duration. It took much longer than they anticipated, and the unforeseen discouraging losses suffered by the British, fighting this raggedy tack army of Boers. In December of 1899, during Black Week, the British Army lost a total of 2,776 British soldiers who were killed, wounded, and captured. The British Army was then divided into three main groups. One was run by under General Sir Redvers Buller, who was the British commander-in-chief in South Africa at the beginning of the war. And then you had Lieutenant General Lord Methuen, and Lieutenant General Gateacre, who controlled the forces in the Cape Colony. Okay, and there were a number of battles at Stormberg, Malgersfontein, and Colenso. And in December 16th, Buller suffered a humiliating loss, and he was replaced by Field Marshal Lord Roberts. Okay, Lord Roberts quickly assembled an entirely new team for headquarters staff, and he chose military men from far and wide. He had Lord Kitchener as Chief of Staff from the Sudan. He had Frederick Russell Burnham, the Chief of the Scouts. He is an American Scout from the Klondike. Okay. He had George Henderson from the Staff College. He had Neville Chamberlain from Afghanistan. And he had William Nicholson, military secretary from Calcutta. Okay. Okay, this war, I want to add, this war was the last of the wars that was fought in the traditional military style. From then on, it all changed. Here you see a picture of the New Zealand troops marching down Wellesley Street in Auckland to embark for South Africa. Here you have Canada troops, the personnel of the Strathcona Horse, en route to South Africa. So the Canadians were involved. Okay, there was a major media campaign waged to convince the pro-British Canadians to support the Boer War on the British side. Okay, and a string of newspaper stories told about so-called Afrikaans atrocities. It was a massive, massive propaganda war. Okay, the Boers were widely thought to murder the wounded, massacre civilians who showed sympathy for the British, flog natives, execute their own people who tried to surrender. And there was no hard evidence to support these stories, which were illustrated only by staff artists. So they didn't have any pictures. It was there was drawings, okay? One newsreel showed a Red Cross tent under fire from the evil Boers, while brave British doctors and nurses strove to treat a wounded soldier. And the film was a falsehood. It was shot in a London suburb using professional actors. The Hamilton Spectator ran a completely false story that the Boers had dynamited a train carrying women and children refugees out of the Transvaal. Okay, the Montreal Star, in a vicious campaign to force Prime Minister Laurier's hand and support an official Canadian contingent to South Africa, wrote similar stories and reported again wrongly that the secretary of the South African League, a pro-imperialistic pressure group, had been kicked to death by a bunch of Boers. This is all coming from the book Marching Us to War by Pierre Berton, okay, who wrote about the Canadian involvement in the South African War. Okay, so massive pressure on Laurier to send Canadian troops to South Africa. Okay, so Laurier didn't want to. Okay, Bourassa didn't want to. Okay, however, so Laurier finally made a compromise. He said young men could offer to go to South Africa of their own free will to fight on the British side. They would be called volunteers, not recruits. The Canadian government would pay for their equipment and transportation, but on their arrival, they would be incorporated into the British forces. Okay, the British government actually offered to pay for transportation and equipment, but Laurier said no. The Canadian Parliament was on recess at the time, so there was no debate about this. Joseph Chamberlain told Canada that its contingent must embark for South Africa no later than October 31st, and more than 7,000 Canadians volunteered for service alongside the British forces there. And the soldiers served with great distinction. 5 of them earned a Victoria Cross for their bravery. So here on your left, you see General Redvers Henry Buller, okay? He launched the offensive against the Boers in the early phases of the war, but then finally at the Battle of Colenso, he was replaced with Lord Frederick Slay Roberts. He was nicknamed Bobs by the troops, okay? And you can see here on the picture, okay, Lord Roberts arriving, okay, in South Africa, okay, left on December 23rd, 1899, okay, and he took his chief of staff, Lord Kitchener, with him to take overall command of the British forces in the Second Boer War. He came to Cape Town on January 10th, 1900. And not even a year later, okay, December 12th, 1900, Roberts handed over the command to Lord Kitchener and returned back to England to receive more medals, I guess. So he didn't last long. So from September 1900 onwards, the Boers changed their tactics, and they conducted a very efficient guerrilla war that kept nearly 500,000 British troops occupied until 1902, okay? And it became rapidly clear that the Boer forces they challenged the Brits with severe tactical challenges. They had a mobile and innovative approach to warfare because they also drew from their experiences from the First Boer War, okay, which was again waged by the British in traditional military formations, okay? The average Boers made up their commandos, were farmers who spent almost all their working life in the saddle. So they're very good riders. They've had command of their ponies or horses, okay? They were farmers and hunters. They depended on the pot, horse, and rifle. They were also skilled stalkers and marksmen. As hunters, they had learned to fire from cover, from a prone position, and they learned how to make the first shot count, knowing that if they missed, the game would either be long gone or could charge and potentially kill them. So they used these skills to their advantage. So here are some of the pictures, okay, of some of the war, the battles. Okay, so Field Marshal Horatio Herbert Kitchener, okay, he was an Irish officer and colonial administrator in the British Army. He was credited in 1898 for having won the Battle of Omdurman and securing control of the Sudan. He was made Baron Kitchener of Khartoum. 1900 till 1902, he was Chief of Staff in the Second Boer War. He played a key role in Lord Roberts' conquest of the Boer republics. And he succeeded Roberts as Commander-in-Chief, by which time the Boer forces had taken to guerrilla fighting, and the British forces imprisoned Boer and African civilians in concentration camps, which we will hear about shortly. So, okay, the next few slides are excerpts from telegrams, journals, letters, okay, between Milner, Chamberlain, Roberts, and so forth, okay? So, okay, if, Jerry, could you read the first excerpt of the telegram from Sir Alfred Milner to Mr. Chamberlain?
September 30th, 1899. I would urge sending out troops themselves as fast as possible, even if on first arrival they cannot move far for want of transport. Every reason to think we shall be fighting in Natal in a couple of days, and at considerable disadvantage at first in respect of numbers.
Now, keep in mind, this is before, okay, war was declared. Chamberlain to Milner. October 5th, 1899. Jerry?
Every provision for the Army Corps is now going on as rapidly as possible. The real sticking point of the whole business was the necessity for purchasing an enormous number of mules. Of course, the animals will have to be raked up in all parts of the world. It is unfortunate that our troops, unlike the Boers, cannot mobilize with a piece of biltong and a belt of ammunition, but require such enormous quantities of transport and impediments. I hope your health continues to bear the strain well.
And then Milner to Lord Selborne on October 11th, 1899. War dates from today, I suppose. We have a bad time before us, and the empire is about to support the greatest strain put upon it since the mutiny. And here are the poor horses being transported on the ships, okay, and thrown overboard if they die on the way there. Okay, Jerry, from Lord Roberts to Queen Victoria.
March 15th, 1900. The Orange Free State south of Bloemfontein is rapidly settling down. The proclamation of an amnesty I have issued are having the desired effect, and men are daily laying down their arms and returning to their usual occupation. It seems unlikely that this state will give much more trouble. The Transvaalers will probably hold out, but their numbers must be greatly reduced, and I trust it will not be long before the war will have been brought to a satisfactory conclusion. We are obliged to rest here for a short time to let men and animals recover, and provide the former with new boots and clothes.
So Lord Roberts was mistaken. The war would go on another 2 years, and it was a guerrilla war. Telegram from Mr. Chamberlain to Sir Alfred Milner. Go ahead.
April 3rd, 1900. The Queen regrets to observe the large number of ladies now visiting and remaining in South Africa, often without imperative reasons, and strongly disapproves of the hysterical spirit which seems to have influenced some of them to go where they are not wanted. I conclude their presence interferes with work of civil and military officers, and they must largely occupy best hotel accommodations required for wounded and invalids officers. Could you send a telegram with or without concurrence of Roberts representing that number of lady visitors is now so considerable as to encroach materially on hotel and railway accommodations, etc., and otherwise impede business, and suggesting that some notice might be issued here calling attention to inconvenience of this unusual number of ladies visiting the seat of war. This I would submit to the Queen, and Her Majesty would instruct me to publish.
So he's setting up here, okay, basically telling Milner what to say in the telegram, okay, that Milner is supposed to write and send to Chamberlain, and then he would take that telegram, which he is now dictated, basically, he would take that one to the Queen, and then she would publish it and say, oh, Lord Milner, Sir Milner really doesn't want the ladies to come to South Africa. Now, why did the ladies come to South Africa? Well, okay, it's because of Miss Emily Hobhouse, okay? So Miss Emily Hobhouse, and I consider her to be one of the heroines in this whole story, okay? She was a British welfare campaigner and anti-war activist and pacifist. She, okay, she was generally considered to be a spinster, okay? And as you know, at that time, if a woman wasn't married, she really failed as a woman, right? But Emily Hobhouse, she went to South Africa because she had heard from a nurse there that was a close friend about the camps that the British had established. She went there, she wrote a report, a 15-page report of a visit to the camps, which was published in 1901. And this report created an instant sensation and led to a public commission. Since her family was quite on the upper social strata, okay, this could not be just simply ignored, okay? So Emily Hobhouse is remembered for bringing to the attention of the British public and working to change the conditions inside the British concentration camps in South Africa, which were built to incarcerate Boer and African civilians during the Second Boer War. So she went there to investigate. Okay, so this is Emily Hobhouse. Okay, she is writing to Lord Kitchener, and this is when she is being deported. She is physically removed from South Africa because they don't want her there because she blew the whistle on what was happening. Okay, so November 1st, Miss Emily Hobhouse, under deportation orders on board the Roslyn Castle ship, writes to Lord Kitchener, I hope in future you will exercise greater width of judgment in the exercise of your high office. To carry out orders such as these is a degradation both to the office and the manhood of your soldiers. I feel ashamed to own you as a fellow countryman. And to Lord Milner, she writes, your brutal orders have been carried out, and thus I hope you will be satisfied. Your narrow incompetency to see the real issues of this great struggle is leading you to such acts as this and many others, straining, meaning staining, your own name and the reputation of England. Okay, and we will get back to that in a minute, okay? There's a telegram from General Roberts to General Kitchener. Jerry?
June 14th, 1900. Let it be known all over the country that in the event of damage being done to the railway or telegraph, the nearest farm will be burnt to the ground. A few examples will be necessary. And let us begin with DeWitt's farm.
Okay, so the British response to the guerrilla war was a scorched earth policy to deny the guerrillas supplies and refuge, okay? And so what they did is they combed through the Orange Free State and the Transvaal, and they basically burned down any farm, okay, any house, any barn. They killed the animals, they slaughtered the animals, okay. They drove the people off into camps. And you can see here, and the vet was, of course, one of the generals of the Boers. That's why he wants to start with the de Wet's farm. Okay. Telegram from Colonel Kelly Kenny to General Roberts. Jerry?
September 8th, 1900. General McDonald refers to me for a definition of the expression lay waste. I suggest the following answer. Gather all food, wagons, Cape carts, sheep, oxen, goats, cows, calves, horses, mares, foals, forage, poultry. Destroy what you cannot eat or remove. Burn all houses and explain. Reason is that they have harbored enemy and reported to British authorities as required. The questions of how to treat women and children and what amount of food and transport to leave them will arise. As regards the first part, they have forfeited all right to consideration and must now suffer for their persistently ignoring warnings against harboring and assisting the enemy. As regards the second, give them the bare amount to reach Windberg and there confiscate all transport. The object is to destroy or remove everything which may help the enemy or his horses or oxen to move or live.
General Roberts replies to Colonel Kelly Kenny, fully approved. I think you should add that Kafirs who are reasonably suspected of having assisted the enemy should also be made prisoners. The more difficulty the people experience about food, the sooner will the war be ended. Okay, and this is an extract from a telegram, from a letter from Sir Alfred Milner to Lady Edward Cecil. Okay, go on, Jerry, please. Thank you.
September 29th, 1900. Kitchener. It is fortunate that I admire him in many ways so much, and admiring, am prepared to stand a lot and never take offense. I am determined to get on with him. But shall I be able to manage this strong, self-willed man in a hurry? For his dying to be off in time to take India and to turn his enormous power into the right channel.
And you have an extract from a letter from, okay. Why did Sir Alfred Milner write to Lady Edward Cecil? Lady Edward Cecil, Violet Cecil, was the wife of Major Lord Edward Cecil. Okay, he was commissioned to South Africa after serving in the Grenadier Guards. And Milner and Lady Violet, okay, began a secret affair that lasted until her departure for England in late 1900s. So Sir Albert Milner, this upstanding character, conducted an affair with one of his subordinates. Okay. All right. Letter from Sir Alfred Milner to Lord Kitchener. Jerry, please.
September 30th, 1900. I should take all the houses I could lay my hands upon, but I should burn no houses except for definite acts of treachery, nor should I attempt to clear the district of foodstuff or of population. Instead of rounding up the cattle, I should turn my attention to chivying the marauders. And in that enterprise, I believe it would be possible gradually to associate some of the inhabitants with us. In any district once cleared of the enemy, garrisoned and policed, I think we should be fully entitled to call the war over. I believe that if we were to devastate all South Africa, an impossible task anyway, we should only find that we had a greater number of roving blackguards to deal with than ever.
Okay, so this is Army Circular written by Kitchener. Okay. Do you mind, Jerry, reading it again?
The General Commander-in-Chief is desirous that all possible means shall be taken to stop the present guerrilla warfare. Of the various measures suggested for the accomplishment of this object, one which has been strongly recommended and has lately been successfully tried on a small scale is the removal of all men, women, and children and natives from the districts which the enemy's bands persistently occupy. This course has been pointed out by surrendered burghers who are anxious to finish the war as the most effective method of limiting the endurance of the guerrillas, as the men and women left on the farms, if disloyal, willingly supply burghers. If loyal, dare not refuse to do so. The women and children brought in should be camped near the railway for supply purposes and should be divided into two categories. First, refugees and the families of neutrals, non-combatants, and surrendered burghers. Secondly, those whose husbands, fathers, and sons are on commando. The preference in accommodation, etc., should of course be given to the first class. Kitchener, December 21st, 1900.
So this is one of, I think, 5 army circulars that Kitchener circulated. So, and with that, the concentration camps were established. They started off as refugee camps that took on people, but then as time went on, they weren't able to handle the crowds, and diseases and starvation started racking the camp, and whole crowds of people started dying. Generally speaking, the nurses and matrons in the camps had nothing but good intentions, but they did their best to help the captives stay healthy and safe. But with too few resources and spaces to do it, the people under their care died at such alarming rates that the camps nearly exterminated an entire population. Okay, so there was inadequate shelter, there was poor diet, there was bad hygiene, there was overcrowding that led to malnutrition. There had endemic contagious diseases such as measles, typhoid, and dysentery, and the kids were particularly vulnerable to that. And there was a shortage of modern medicine facilities, and there was medical mistreatment, and so many internees died. And of course, you had different levels of concentration camps. On the highest ones were the ones where the surrendered Boers. The second one were families of Boers who were still fighting. And then lastly, you had the concentration camps for the indigenous population, which were, it defies words. Okay. Native South Africans were put to work building a railway. So it wasn't enough that you were put in a concentration camp, you were also put to work, okay? And the original caption to this photograph was meant to be propaganda to defend the concentration camps. It was proudly noting that the forced laborers were singing while they were working on the railroads here. So this is a map, okay? It's a German map, okay? All those little black triangles, okay? They're concentration camps. So there were 45 concentration camps held in all for the 150,000 Boer refugees. There were 64 concentration camps constructed to house the 115,000 native Africans, okay? Of the 28,000 Boer men captured as prisoners of war, 25,630 of them were sent overseas, okay? They were prisoner of war camps opened up in St. Helena, okay? They got about 5,000 prisoner of wars. They were sent to Ceylon, another 5,000. They were sent to Bermuda and to India. Okay. They were sent to Portugal. Okay. So outside, away from their families. Those are the men. Okay. Okay. Extract from Telegram. Kitchen to Roberts. This is the famous, on the right-hand side, you can see the famous report from Emily Hobhouse, 15-page pamphlet, okay? July 19th, 1901. I see a number of ladies are coming out. I hope it will calm the agitators in England. I doubt there being much for them to do here, as the camps are very well looked after. And then what happened after Emily, okay, Hobhouse put out her report, okay, the British government found it necessary that they would set up a commission, a ladies' commission, okay. It was set up by the War Office in 1900 to inquire into the conditions of women and children in the British concentration camps in South Africa, and it was chaired by Millicent Fawcett, okay? Now, the Ladies' Commission was only allowed to go to certain places. And this is from Milner's Journal. Jerry, would you please read?
August 1901, after the inspection visit of the Ladies' Commission. In considering the steps necessary for improving the health of the camps, we now have the benefit of the experience of the Ladies' Committee. They have furnished notes on the condition of the great majority of the camps, and it is evident that they have subjected them to a most careful investigation. Their suggestions must, I think, strike everyone as both thorough and practical, and we have much cause to be grateful to them for the reasonable spirit in which they have approached their task. I think a very grave responsibility would rest upon us if any one of these suggestions were not acted upon, except there was some insuperable physical obstacle to carrying it out.
So on December 4th, 1902, Lord Milner comments on the high death rate in the Free State concentration camps. He says, okay, the theory that all the weakly children being dead, the rate would fall off. It is not so far borne out by the facts. I take it the strong ones must be dying now and that they will all be dead by the spring of 1903. And Lord Milner, okay, December 7th, 1901, to Mr. Chamberlain back home. The black spot, the one very black spot in the picture is the frightful mortality in the concentration camps. I entirely agree with you in thinking that while 100 explanations may be offered and 100 excuses made, they do not really amount to an adequate defense. I should much prefer to say at once, as far as the civil authorities are concerned, that we were suddenly confronted with a problem not of our making, with which it was beyond our power properly to grapple. And no doubt its vastness was not realized soon enough. The whole thing, I think now, has been a mistake. So the British employed scorched earth tactics and held many Boers in concentration camps as a means to separate commanders from their source of shelter, food, and supply. The strategy had its intended effect, but an estimated 27,000 Boers, mainly women and children under 16, died in these camps from hunger and disease. So on the left, you see, this is a famous case, okay? They actually, the camp matrons had actually accused the mother of this child of deliberately starving her. And okay, the camp had said to not to interfere with the child, as she was a nuisance anyway. So, okay. The result of the Boer War, Second Boer Wars, the annexation of the Boer republics to the British Empire in 1902. You see the picture here of Boer fighters, guerrilla fighters handing over their weapons. There was the last of the Boers finally surrendered in May of 1902, and the war ended with the Treaty of Vereinigung, signed on May 31st, 1902. There was a period of obstinacy, and then the British reneged and offered the Boers generous terms of conditional surrender so that the war would be brought to a victorious conclusion. So the treaty, okay, there was the peace conference, okay, you can see this picture has British and Boer officials in there, okay. And you see Kitchener on the front in the middle, and all the way to the left is De Wet, whose farms he had burned down. General Botha, who becomes Prime Minister of South Africa in 1910, I believe, okay, and so forth, okay. The Boers were given £3 million for reconstruction and were promised eventual limited self-government, which was granted in 1906 and 1907. And the treaty ended the existence of the Transvaal and Orange Free States as independent Boer republics and placed them within the British Empire. The Union of South Africa was established as a dominion of the British Empire in 1910. Louis Botha was heading that up, okay. So this was called the Union of South Africa. The South Africa Act of 1909 consolidated the Cape Colony, Natal, Transvaal, and the Orange Free State into one nation. Under the provisions of the Act, the Union became the independent dominion of the British Empire, governed under a form of constitutional monarchy, with the British monarch represented by a Governor-General, much like Canada is today. So Milner drafted the terms of surrender signed in Pretoria, okay. He was made Viscount Milner, okay, for the recognition of his wonderful services in the Cape Colony on July 15th, 1902. Around this time, he became a member of the Coefficients Dining Club of Social Reformers, set up in 1902 by the Fabian Society campaigners Sidney and Beatrice Webb. Immediately after the war, Milner published the Letters Patent, establishing the system of Crown colony government in the Transvaal and Orange River colonies, and he changed his title of administrator to that of governor. And then massive reconstructive work was necessary because the ravages of the war were absolutely enormous. He provided a steady revenue leveled a 10% tax on the annual net produce of the gold mines, okay, for use of rebuilding. He devoted special attention to the repatriation of the Boers. He settled land settlements by British colonists. He worked on education, justice, the constabulary, and the development of railroads, okay. By December 1903, Milner was back in Johannesburg, okay, and he pondered the crisis in the gold mining industry because there was a shortage of native labor. And so with the assent of the home government back home in England, he proposed that they should import Chinese coolies, each on 3-year contracts, and the first batch of workers reached the Rand in June of 1904. So, okay. The Peace Treaty of Vereinigung included the following points. Uitlanders could return to the Transvaal. The Boers had to lay down their weapons. Dutch would still be taught in schools and used in courts. A civil government would replace the military administration. Self-government would be promoted. Voting rights for Black people would only be discussed once the two new colonies could govern themselves. Financial help would be provided for poor citizens. The two new colonies' debts would be paid. And 39,000 Uitlanders returned to the Transvaal, and the mines opened up again. And these also meant that the two new British colonies could generate their own income and become financially independent. There were Anglo-Boer prisoners. Okay, this is a picture of Anglo-Boer prisoners in St. Helena, showing old men and young boys with toys made at the camp. So as I said, St. Helena, Ceylon, Bermuda, India, okay, all in together, nearly 26,000 prisoners of wars were sent overseas. In the book, this book that I read, No Place for a Lady, it's a fiction, a historical fiction, but it has a lot of documents in there, okay? These are some of the figures. So 448,435 white soldiers and 30,000 blacks fought on the side of the British. 75,000 men fought on the side of the Boers. 27,927 white men, women, and children died in the concentration camps. 22,074 were children under the age of 16. 4,177 were women over the age of 16. Probably, because nobody kept count, 20,000 blacks died in the concentration camps, of whom 81% were children, and 10% of the Boer population of the two republics died during the war. So it was the bloodiest, longest, and most expensive war Britain engaged in between 1815 and 1915. It cost more than 200 million pounds, and more than 22,000 men were lost to Britain. Okay, yes, this is the Women's Memorial in Bloemfontein, okay, devoted to the women, okay, and children that lost their lives in the Boer War. And it kind of reflects the religious belief of the Boers, because on the monument right here, it says "Die will, you will geschehen," okay, which means it's from the Lord's Prayer. "Thy will be done." C Company returns from the Boer War, King Street East from Young. Okay. There's the South African War Memorial in Toronto, Ontario, set up in 1908. Okay. And this is 1910 Africa, not all of it. But as you can see, something very important here, okay? So now you have Cecil Rhodes' dream of a railway from all the way from Egypt down to South Africa becoming much more real, but there's one major obstacle. This is 1910, in 4 more years, okay? You see another war erupting, and one of the antagonists in this is German East Africa right here. So you can see it's blocking Cecil Rhodes' dream. Okay. And that's the story.
Thank you, Madeline. That was a tour de force. I got a question. What about the Portuguese? I had a contact who's he brought up some stuff regarding this effort by the various Portuguese administrators to connect some east-west line that was also disruptive to some of the Rhodes agenda. Now this contact of mine, I think, was a little bit overly romantic about the Portuguese being somehow the noble imperialists, which I don't buy that for a second. But what factor did they play into this, or did that come up in your story, in your research?
Yeah, actually, I did mention that earlier. Marquez, Lourdes Marquez, okay. That was a railway going from Pretoria all the way to the Portuguese East Coast, okay, which was the Transvaal wanted to get that built. But they had problems financially. And so then Kruger went along with building the Cape Railroad with the financial help of Cecil Rhodes. Okay, that set off the whole crisis around the drift crisis. But definitely yes, because that was the Transvaal's closest way to go to the sea was through the Portuguese the Portuguese side of Africa, South Africa.
Cool, thank you.
I definitely would not. Yeah, okay. I mean, they had sugar cane plantations and indentured labor and all that too.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I'll just say before we jump into the first question from Maureen, I really appreciated you giving better context to the poem that we had heard the other week from Rudyard Kipling. Yeah, fascinating. Because by itself, as a standalone, if you don't think about the context, it's like, wow, that has some really universal life lessons in it. Good poem. But then when you actually look at the context in which he wrote it and what was motivating his heart, what was he thinking about? You can, it's like you can't unsee that. You can't, right? Very interesting way to another factor for those trying to think, how do I judge art? This is an important lesson that you just touched upon that we should all just take in mind as we're thinking about evaluating what we think of as being good art, bad art, whatever, with what you just did. A lot of people are taught you can't do that. So I really appreciate that little side vignette.
Yeah, because I'm sure that poem was widely read and people did not know where it came from, right? There has the origin. Why was it written? That's okay.
Yeah.
It does not. This is important because absolutely what you say is important because you have to know the intention of something, right? Why was it written? And then it gives you a complete different view and a different approach to something. Yes.
Absolutely. On that note, so let's go to Maureen. Are you still there?
I am. And you just went right into what I was going to say.
Oh, sorry.
Both of you, which is great. So what I did, I tasked myself with reading Ruskin's speech, Oxford speech, which I'd not read before. Because my knowledge of Ruskin is simply from the art side. And if you look at Ruskin from the art side, particularly if you like pre-Raphaelite art and you like the arts and crafts movement, you get one perspective on Ruskin, right? But the interesting thing is, I read it. It's pretty short, really, but I was very impressed by the possibility of analyzing that as nationalist propaganda. It's a fairly on a more covert level, it's pretty horrific. But it shows you how you can take something that is quite noble and you can take it and create a narrative that justifies anything. And a beautiful thing about his little speech is that it's short enough to really analyze and see how this can happen. So what occurred to me was that, you had in the past, it's almost like a religious propaganda, right? So if you had religious propagandas from every religious group, right? Major religious group. It's what got you into the Crusades. It's what got you into all kinds of wars. It's like a marching song, right? So if you look at a kind of religious propaganda, overtaken by now a nationalist propaganda and narrative, which is interesting to look at. My next question would be the reflecting on what the current narrative development is at this time. So if you looked at one aspect of a narrative that's being put out there, and again, how many narratives are put out there and how many are going to stick and how many aren't, it's like throw it all out there and see what sticks on the wall. But if you look at one narrative now, you've got your AI narrative. Harari is probably the great spokesman for that. If you need to put somebody out there, it's a kind of technocracy and the usefulness of AI. Then you've got the idea of equity, and you've got a certain kind of woke narrative that goes along with that. And then you have environmentalism, and you kind of have a green economy narrative left over that. And then you've got the leftover kind of liberalism agenda as well. So, you know, it's kind of interesting to see the same thing always happens. The results are always the same. There are these narratives, you get people to fight. It's usually done fairly ineffectively. There's a huge cost of death. So I'm just interested in reflecting on what, since we can see what happened here, Africa's a great narrative that you've given on how this has all emerged and how this has happened. We can look at it now in your presentation over a couple of hours and see how all this has transpired and how it repeats itself and again and again and again. So I'm just curious about people's ideas of what the present day narrative looks like.
I don't really know how to answer this. You know, it's interesting, Maureen. I stumbled into this just by accident because I read that historical fiction, right? And I thought, wait, I don't know anything about what happened there. So I want to investigate this. Okay. So then I started, that was about 6 months ago, as Matt said last on Wednesday night. And so, okay, I still don't know a lot. Okay. Because there's still so much more that you could more investigate. The one thing I need to say is, what I did learn from this whole thing is that if the Boers didn't have such an absolutely ideological disposition of who they were, if they would have been more flexible, a lot of it could have been averted. Okay, but they had this really narrow mindset about, okay, being God's ordained children. And they had this not stubborn, stoic disposition, okay, which you also could see on the Women's Memorial in Bloemfontein, okay. Thy will, okay, takes place, right? In German, it's dein Wille geschehe, and it's very similar.
Thy will be done.
That will be done, okay. And so if they didn't have that kind of underpinning, okay, things could have happened completely differently, I believe.
But you could say the same thing about religious wars.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Stephen.
Thanks, Matt. Magdalena, thank you. That was borderline epic and kind of the amount of detail and research you put into that. So really appreciate that effort. Very informative. So I've got a question that kind of looks at things strategically. And I'm thinking about the strategic design of all the nefarious acts to create the conditions necessary for a railway connecting Egypt all the way down to South Africa. Now, when I look back at kind of the American system of political economy, the Lincoln era cooperation, Americans helping the Russians develop the railway and all that neat sort of stuff. When I think of the Halford Mackinder stuff and putting obstacles up to the economic integration of Eurasia, the strategic aim of the British seems at face value counterintuitive to their normal modus operandi. And I'm just wondering if that's because they thought they could get enough control in Africa that they could integrate it economically and control the whole thing versus not being able to do so across Eurasia, or if there was something else going on. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are with regards to that.
Okay, so I think I mentioned it earlier in the presentation. This war really changed the way the British leadership conducted their imperial affairs. Whereas before this war, okay, and during the beginning of the war, okay, you had the belief by the British leadership, okay, that you had to be on ground. You had to be the administrator of these territories. That you were doing hands down, directing what was going on in an area, okay? After this, okay, and I think Milner was one of the very important people in that, okay? They set up the British Empire like they are today, like they ran Canada, okay? Let the natives run themselves, but we are on the top. So it's a different approach, and it's shifted at that point of the history of the British Empire. There was a shift in the way that they started doing things. Yeah, so that's the one thing I want to say. And of course, yes, okay, the railroad, yeah, we would think, oh, that's a great idea because it's good for the economy and so forth, okay? But the way the British were looking at a railroad is from a different point of view. It's the supplier of the raw materials. It's the supplier of using the materials from these different places, from these different countries, okay, to benefit them, okay, which is a completely contradictory approach to building a railroad to develop the area as a basis for industrialization of a country. So two
different intent.
Yes, absolutely.
And just a quick follow-on question based on what you've just said. Could we trace back in the modern era the whole concept of free trade to what the British learned and their change in perspective with the Boer War? Would the whole auspices of the Anglo-American world for free trade be the modern incarnation or reflection of that experience and that lesson?
I think it definitely had an impact. I don't know if it's really the origin of the free trade, okay, as we know it now, but it definitely will have had an impact.
Oh, I could say one quick thing on that.
Yeah.
And Cynthia's book, The Empire in Which the Black Sun Never Set, is really invaluable for this because, you know, keep in mind Milner is part of the Coefficients Club. You know, he's working with the Webbs, with H.G. Wells, Rudyard Kipling, and Conan Doyle are all working for the Britain's Ministry of Propaganda, you know, during World War II. But so you have this enmeshment of the Fabians and the Round Table operation really shaping things. And a part of what Cynthia gets at is that the origins of fascism isn't the outgrowth of nationalism or anything national, as we've been told in our schools, but really it's an international, what could be understood as international or imperial socialism. That's it. That's what H.G. Wells, Milner, they were all imperial socialists. And part of that involved free trade, but a highly a federated global system that had a much more hierarchical chain of command, but with the appearance, the illusion of freedom of the parts. So to give the individual little micro regions the illusion that they had some freedom, and free trade was a good way that the British had proven an effective way of controlling the world, and using capitalism as an excuse to destroy the ability of target countries, right, to stand on their own 2 feet. So this got kind of just, they took the what worked of the 19th century and then just added to it this whole Fabian socialism thing that then required obviously local administrators who would be fascists to enforce the program in local regions, like a Mussolini who came out of the fascist war, or the socialist. He was a socialist, right? In 1919, 1920, that's what Mussolini was. That's why not, you know, National Socialism. It's not nationalism. It's more, it came out as the need to manage locally zones, right?
See, it's this whole idea that, oh, you run yourself, right? But you report to us.
Yeah.
Got to report to us, right? Okay. And, you know, you run yourself. But as long as you know, as long as you know, okay, you are not the top dog, right? Okay. We are the top dog, okay? And then also the other thing that was used very much was this whole issue of media, okay, propaganda, as you could see in the case of Canada. How did they get Canada involved in this whole South Africa situation? I mean, that blew my mind when I was reading that, okay? I couldn't believe it. I thought, what, really? They started already media propaganda and lying? And then I thought, oh, yeah, okay. So they had a long time to practice for the Iraq War. That's where it started, right? And so that's another aspect of it, okay? To use the media in a way to achieve what they wanted to achieve.
Yep. Okay. Thank you.
Russell, did you want to ask your question, or do you want me to read it out?
I can probably. I don't know if you can hear me.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was actually born in Rhodesia, as it was known when I was born, and then it became Zimbabwe. And it's you've touched on the part of your story where you talked about the founding of Rhodesia, the invasion of Matabeleland, which happened just before, I think, the Second Boer War, and also the Zulu Wars, and you know, the conference of the conference that led to the scramble for Africa. Not just Britain, but a number of nations were very successful in a very short amount of time in a very bloody conquest of Africa. And the Boer War, in fact, is maybe an exception to these wars, because Britain faced defeat. So I just wanted to bring into this conversation the role of a particular nasty device, which is a machine gun, which was invented in North America and used against indigenous tribes, and subsequently brought into Africa, in Nigeria, in the Zulu War, in the Sudan as well. And it doesn't come into the story, but actually the capacity to destroy traditional armies of indigenous men, like thousands, tens of thousands of people, with just a few people with machine guns, is actually shocking. So in the mythology I had as a schoolboy growing up, the colonial forces were somehow miraculously strong and powerful, and this fed into this idea of superiority that you've mentioned, this idea that the Britain being a superior civilization should have a right, or even an obligation to subject the world. So this I suppose it's just a little thing that I suddenly realized one day, that the British forces, that my ancestors, if you like, that conquered this country, did it with this new invention, a Maxim machine gun. And I've studied it since then. It's quite interesting, but it was the weapon of mass destruction of the time. And I suppose I've answered my own question, but what the Boers did was they did not allow the technological advantage that the British had to be brought into play in the asymmetric warfare. We're now seeing it in some other theaters today, but I wondered if you knew about whether that initial British attempt relied on technology such as the machine gun. Anyway, sorry, that's a long speech, but that's my question. Yeah.
Okay. You know, I did not come. I think I saw one mention maybe of a Maxim gun. Okay. But most of them, they were still talking about rifles. So what I read. So, but I appreciate that you brought that up, because absolutely, I mean, that would explain why 6,000 Zulu were killed in that battle on December 16th, right?
Yeah.
I mean, how can you do that? But then again, the Zulu, they had spears and they had rawhide shields. So bullets penetrate those things easily, right?
They actually did have Martini rifles, which were supplied by traders, but these were single action rifles. So they felt that they could challenge the British, and they weren't marksmen, but they did have some rifles, but they did not have machine guns. And there's the stories of, when you read some of the soldiers' stories of mowing down the indigenous armies, like with scythes, harvesting crops. They referred to. It's quite shocking. In the Sudan, they did that the same. So Kitchener, who you've talked about, came from Sudan.
Yeah.
And in all the stories of his glorious conquest of Sudan, they don't mention that when he was defeating the Mahdi's armies, he did it with the aid of machine guns, which had never been encountered by these indigenous tribes people before. It was just, I think, 2 or 3 years. But the Boers will have seen this, and they will have known that it's impossible to. So it gave them maybe some. I don't know. I've got no grounds for saying this, but I wondered if they'd kind of taken this on board, and I wondered if the British imagined that they would have the same success initially.
So
I mean,
okay, sorry. So once I decided to do this presentation, one of the decisions I made deliberately is I didn't want to go into the specifics of battles, because then you get bogged down and it's just going to go off the side. Okay, so I deliberately didn't want to get into the how and whens and so forth, of the battles. But I appreciate that you brought that up. Thank you.
Yeah.
We have time for a couple more questions. So I see Hassan's been waiting there patiently with the digital hand. So Hassan, go for it.
No, thank you. And thank you, Magdalena, for a truly fantastic presentation, really well researched, well delivered. I asked the question during your part one. My slice of study of this is I'd come back from a number of tours, this is around 20 years ago, and I wanted to know more about what were we doing in Bosnia and Afghanistan, and had it rhymed before in history. So as a part of Command and Staff College, I went in pretty deep into the Canadian involvement in the Boer War. A little bit of time in the first half of the war, where Russell, to your question, the machine gun played a little bit of a role, but not too much, because the Boers were already smart, and they just melted away into the veldt and said, "We're not playing that game. We're not playing that game." What was quite fascinating, though, is inside the regimental records that are there with the Strauss-Konas, the Patricias, and others, as well as in the National Archives, it entirely supports the narrative that you provided. But the only comment I wanted to add is when it came to the tactics that were used to fight that asymmetric war, was how incremental and creeping the narrative was. So what the soldiers were told when they first went across in 1899, 1900, to then what happened in the second half of the war, things like in terms of the policy of what they were supposed to do as far as rules of engagement. So as an example, it started first in a very tiny ways. So you would have roving patrols, they would get fired upon by a farmstead, and then they would get new orders in terms of what are you supposed to do now that the Boers are being supported by the locals who are giving them food or cover or whatever else. So over a period of 12 to 18 to 24 months, you had this creeping narrative of, eventually it got to concentration camps. They created rows of pillboxes that were about 1,000 yards apart. They burned down all the farmland. And the reason they kept those pillboxes 1,000 yards apart is it meant that every single station was in rifle range of each other. And they used that to cut off all the means of escape and channel populations where they wanted to and stop the Boers. So they did a whole ton of things like that, but largely relied on stuff like rifles. But it was fascinating to see what the commentary was way down at the ground level as that change happened over 12, 18, 24 months, as well as the questioning that was occurring way down at that level as that kind of incrementalism, kind of happened. But fantastic presentation. Thank you.
They did the pillboxes, you're right, and and they located them strategically apart. What they also did is they used barbed wire, pulled them through the fields, right? Of course, the Boers being on their ponies, riding across would be caught in those wires. That was another tactic that they came up with. Okay. But yes, I think the impact, okay, of Kitchener's decisions to the scorched earth policy, okay, was the major, well, that was finally led to the demise of the Boer republics. Absolutely. Okay. And since he has used those guns, okay, up in Egypt, right? I don't think he had any trepidations or bad conscience about using this kind of tactics in South Africa.
Mm. Yeah, also the point you made on the propaganda as well. It's just we're seeing so much of this nowadays, the dehumanization of a certain people. On the one hand, you know, and the idea of choking people off in concentration camps. Obviously, it's fresh in our mind. And I put a little note in the chat box, a message that Theodore Herzl had actually written to Cecil Rhodes, admiring Rhodes's methods and encouraging Rhodes to give a formal endorsement to Herzl in the colonization project as far as purging the land of the troublesome people who were there for the more chosen people. So there's an actual quote by Herzl directly to Rhodes on that point in the description in the
Oh
chat
my
box.
God. Oh my
Which-
God. Okay. Oh my God. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, it's sick.
Yeah.
Jerry said something interesting in the chat. He mentioned British Israelite movement. And Jerry, you can't just say that without developing it. What's your fascinating thought?
I was responding to a comment of Maureen's. Again, I always do it, Maureen. You get me going. But the, she was saying, compare it to today, and it, I've been very involved in Madeline's presentation on this, and I watched the Boer War, and I just see so many parallels to the war in the Middle East that's going on right now. The Milner created the excuse to start the war, and you have the same thing happening in Israel. The scorched earth policy the British invented. My God, that's what the Israeli army is doing now in Gaza. The concentration camps. Well, Gaza is a concentration camp. It's surrounded. You can't go in and out. But the basis for it, Tony Chaikin has done a lot of good research on this, on the British Israelite, that around the same time, the last half of the 19th century, 1870s, 1880s, there was this religious fundamentalist movement started in England that the Anglo-Saxons were actually the lost tribes of Israel. And therefore because of that, they were ordained to rule the world. And, that's part of the way they tried to drag the United States into it, saying, look, we're Anglo-Americans. You should be part of our race to run the world. And that was the justification for it. But also their work with the Zionists that you brought up, Matt. It's that same outlook that, you have with the Netanyahu regime as to the religious phony justifications for what they're doing. And this British Israelite thing, that they're the master race. I mean, you see a glimpse of it too with the Boers. They thought they were the master race too. I guess they read a different Bible than the British, but it's this ideological foundation that manipulates them. Because the big flaw with the Boers was, if they had expanded the franchise to vote, well, to the Uitlanders, but also you're looking at the Africans themselves, right? The black population, which were totally denied and looked on as in part of the inferior race. And it's that outlook that Tony called the British Israelite movement, and this crazy thing that, you have to have the Jews go in and occupy Israel, because once they do that, then it'll bring on end times, and then we'll all get raptured. And you have a whole section of evangelical fundamentalists in the United States who support that thinking. And they're very anti-Semitic, these people. I mean, they really hate Jewish people. I mean, that was originally, one way we can get the Jews out of Britain, we'll set up Palestine and kick them out over there. And you have the same thing in the United States, where you have these, it's a form of British Israelites who are the craziest in terms of getting that war going. Not that they care how many Palestinians or how many Israelis are killed, but they think this is going to bring on their crazy religious belief for the end of the world, and then they'll all get raptured, and whatever that means. But it's it comes about at the same time as the Boer War, the late 1800s.
Well, and Milner was also a co-author of the Balfour Declaration too. It was one of him, Amory, and Balfour were all co-wrote that thing before it became, what it became.
Yes.
Magdalena,
yes, it's another 4-hour discussion, which I didn't want to bring up, but I had to add that comment. But Tony Chaikin has done an enormous amount of work on it. He has some articles on his Substack, if people want to read more about it. But that was my little comment I put in there. That's what it was.
Cool. Magdalena, did you have anything to add on to that, or?
No, he said it.
Okay. Well, I think this has just been a wonderful 3-hour voyage, and I'm really so happy that we got this recorded. Part 1, for those who missed it, is going to be in the description box under this video. Check all of this out. It's really worth taking a lot of notes. I'm so grateful that you did this and pulled it together in the way that you did. And again, the substance, you're giving so much to the future generations of classical tragedians who are looking for material to work with. You've brought a lot to the surface, and I'm hoping that either today in our lifetime or somewhere beyond, someone watches this video and has the idea, okay, there's some new Shakespearean tragedies that can be composed based on this work. But thank you so much.
Now you know why. Now you know why it took so long.
That was well worth the wait. All right, folks. Thank you, everybody, for taking this time, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Okay.
Cheers, everyone.
Okay. Bye.
Ciao.